This week on the Capitol Report, attention returns to state contract reform with two bills up for debate, one of them Governor Rell's version. Top priorities this session, economic growth and new jobs, are the focus of public hearings. And the public speaks out on proposed changes to Connecticut's bottle bill. Now, a look behind some of the legislative issues and events in the spotlight this week on the Capitol Report.
Courtesy to the committee and the public, we're going to begin our meeting.
Two state contracting reform bills were discussed during a public hearing in the Government Administration and Elections Committee this week. House Bill 5051 is the governor's bill, and House Bill 5053 is the proposal by the GAE committee. Governor Rell vetoed two previous versions of the legislation last year.
I'm going to call Commissioner Fleming from DPW forward, and Kevin Rash, the governor's legal counsel, to join Commissioner.
As most of you know, the governor proposed this reform legislation last year. This issue has had a thorough airing in a number of public settings, public hearings, and meetings. Virtually everyone seems to think that the essential thrust of the bill would be a good public policy. The governor, as you know, had hoped to sign this reform before now. It is unfortunate that this reform has been held up for so long for reasons having, I think, little to do with the issues that gave rise to the bill in the first place. What has happened is that the privatization provisions have been added to the bill. They have not been given, the Contract Standards Board has not been given the ability to review those along with all of the other reforms that are necessary to prevent the abuses that we've seen in the past. And I think perhaps a good and honest compromise on this issue would be to allow that contracting standard board that has representation from the legislature, from the executive branch, from both political parties, with input from the public sector unions and from commissioners, to put together a reform proposal in the form of a procurement code, bring it back to this legislature, and at that point, that code can be adopted without the delays that we've seen over the last year. That is what the governor wants. That is what the bill will allow us to do, which she has put before you.
In the past, Governor Rell has expressed concerns with prior versions of contract reform legislation, particularly those portions concerning privatization. The administration has had and will continue to have serious concerns with any language in a bill that restricts or prevents the administration from procuring goods and services in a cost-effective manner from private providers, especially in situations where no state employees are laid off.
Everything we do here is a process, and I got to say, this administration, your boss, has engaged in a dialogue on almost every controversial issue up here, whether it's school nutrition or civil unions or budgetary matters, tax policy. There's been a dialogue. On this one issue of outsourcing standards, I do not think since the first round there has been any significant dialogue on reaching a compromise with respect to this issue of the standards. What is the governor's position on outsourcing standards? We've given them to you in clear detail here. They've been here bill after bill now for the last year and a half. What is the governor's position with respect to those standards?
I would say the governor would support contracting standards, and if you look at her bill that she has submitted, 5051, one of the things that the board is required to do under her bill is to set forth those privatization or outsourcing standards, whichever term we decide to use this afternoon. So it is not something that we are opposed to. It is not something that we're ducking, but it is something I think that, as Commissioner Fleming has already said, is appropriately determined by that Contract Standards Board as part of an overall procurement code.
It has been almost 2 years now, and I remember the discussions about having a moratorium or not having a moratorium. We might very well have legislation before this legislature right now dealing with all of these issues if we had moved forward at that point in time. I think the governor is being consistent. She's asking for privatization standard issues to be viewed along with all of the other problems we've seen in the way the state procures services and goods in the private sector.
Well, let me just say that both bills allow the Contract Standards Board to develop those uniform procedures dealing with outsourcing for the long run. I think where the problem comes in is the interim standards that we're trying to address. The governor's bill does not address any procedure put in place in the interim. And I agree with you. Had we passed this bill, the original version with the moratorium, we'd be getting pretty damn close now to, excuse my pretty darn close to a point in time when we would have that back, those standards back for final consideration. But we don't have, we didn't do that. As a matter of fact, the moratorium was one of the central points of objection in the first round.
I think there's been some valid concerns raised concerning the nonprofits, most notably, as I've mentioned to you, mentioned here in the committee with Senator Newton. It was a nonprofit organization. We had the same situation post John Rowland's resignation, where he was hired by a nonprofit organization doing business with the state, where they privatized education services. There's a serious issue out there. So I think the governor, in her veto message said she didn't want anything in that was going to hamper the nonprofits. Let her suggest something, and that gives us a beginning point on that issue.
I appreciate your invitation, Representative, and I would just recommend also that when understanding the governor's position, you read the veto messages in their whole together, because I think they go to beyond just the nonprofit issue. There are a number of other issues that she does delineate in her message, both July rather, and then later in the fall.
I'd hate to go back to the past because it just creates more problems, but the reality of it is one of her parts of the veto message was dealing with nonprofits.
You're right, which is one
So now in
of.
this legislation, 5051 that she's proposing, let her put her own suggestion in how we deal with the nonprofit community. Because there's been a series of corruption that have existed. I'm not suggesting the nonprofits out there are unethical or corrupt, but we've had instances where that has occurred. So it seems to me if that's a major concern, then let her address it in 5051. It also gives us a beginning point for that particular area.
If you'd like to learn more about the two contract reform bills, go to www.cga.ct.gov and do a search for HB 5051, the governor's bill, and HB 5053, the GA committee bill.
Thank you, Warner. Good to see you.
The Commerce Committee held two public hearings this week regarding bills related to growing Connecticut's economy. On Thursday, Senate President Donald Williams testified on Senate Bill 1, Jobs for the 21st Century.
I understand that at this point in our short session, there are still items to be fleshed out in terms of the specifics of this bill. But one thing is clear to me, and I'm sure it's clear to you as members of the Commerce Committee, and that is creating jobs, retaining jobs, and growing the economy in the state of Connecticut is our first and foremost priority now and in the future in the state of Connecticut. One of the things that we really need to focus on is creating a different environment. In order to do that, we look at the different sectors that are out there. One proposal that has been there in the past, I know this committee has supported this concept in years past, is to phase out the manufacturing and machinery equipment tax. We are unique in New England. We are unique on the East Coast of the United States as a state that imposes this tax that literally drives manufacturing jobs out of Connecticut.
Because I truly believe, Senator, that I know that not everyone is going to be happy with the bill. I know there are some aspects of the bill that I am not pleased with, but in order for you to get the entire picture, you just have to compromise in some aspects of it. But I truly believe that there are some folks from cities who are saying that they will be losing some revenues.
Unlike other taxes, there have been some proposals out there, car tax and in the past pilot and all the rest of it, where municipal leaders are rightly concerned about loss of revenue over time. This tax drives jobs and companies out of the state. So they might be worried about the state not delivering 100% of reimbursement for the manufacturing tax. It's our intention that we do that and keep towns whole. But the alternative is that we drive these companies out, and over time the cities and towns lose the entire tax base generated by that particular company in that town, and we as a state lose those jobs.
We are very encouraged that our work this year will lead to a lot of fruit in the short term, and particularly a lot of fruit for our young people and jobs for our citizens in the long term.
On Tuesday, testimony before the Commerce Committee focused in part on accountability provisions for state economic development assistance agencies, which would prohibit boards of directors from having any financial interest in any organization receiving financial assistance through their agencies.
We are concerned that the proposed change to the director conflict of interest provision in Section 32-11A, subsection H, will disqualify many worthy director candidates in circumstances where there is no actual conflict of interest concern.
I'd like to remind you that our board members are all unpaid volunteers, and it seems unfair that they or the company for which they work should be prohibited from seeking financial assistance simply because of their volunteer position on CI's board of directors. We believe that this provision would make it very difficult for CI to recruit qualified board members and get a board that has the diverse experience that we need to be successful.
To the best of your knowledge, would there be anyone now who might be in violation of this if this were indeed to pass, that clause about the investment criteria involving the board of directors?
Actually, yes, I would have several board members who are on my board right now who would have to resign.
We all know that the credibility of any public agency depends on it being one of absolute honesty and integrity and meeting a standard that assures not just that they know they are honest, but that the public knows as well that their credibility is maintained. And this legislation is aimed precisely at that objective. I may have misheard the testimony offered just now that in effect several board members might have concerns or might have problems meeting the standards in this act, but I think that piece of information, if true, speaks volumes about the need for exactly this kind of legislation.
Why do you think that a board member, say, and I was talking about Connecticut Innovations, why a board member stepping aside and recusing himself is not sufficient in terms of having a conflict of interest in something that the remainder of the board does?
All I can do, Senator LeBeau, is repeat what I think is a matter of common sense and what I said during the last session when we discussed this issue. If a board member has a financial interest, if that board member recuses himself or herself, if the remainder of the board is aware of that recusal and of the reason for it, which would be disclosed, there has to be an impact on the decision making.
The Commerce Committee will hold another public hearing on Tuesday, February 28th. For more information, go to www.cga.ct.gov, and the bulletin will provide further details.
We would like to commence with this afternoon's public hearing and House Bill 5079.
Yes, Madam Chair. I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to again, just briefly speak to in support of this legislation. Senator, you just mentioned a few minutes ago about critical workforce shortage areas. I don't know how many meetings I've been in this building alone in the last 6 months that have addressed the critical shortage and the critical shortage of students in the math and science pipeline.
This bill would create a program that funds high school students who want to pursue advanced studies in math and science through the state's community technical colleges.
What this legislation would do is actually would provide for tuition assistance to allow for dual enrollment, high school students to advance themselves by being able to enroll at a community college, very focused, taking math and science courses.
And we also know through community colleges that community college graduates tend to stay in the state to work. And I think it is probably a logical conclusion that if they go on to a state school and get a four-year degree, they will probably also stay in the state.
For more information on Bill 5079, go to www.cga.ct.gov.
was at before this. So.
Public Safety and Security Committee heard testimony on more than 20 bills raised for review this session. Among those testifying, the brother of East Hartford police officer Brian Azelton, shot in the line of duty 7 years ago.
To date, my brother's estate has received only $4,000 for funeral and burial expenses pursuant to the workers' compensation statutes because he left no dependents. This glitch in the workers' compensation law appears to our family to be both unjust and to render a disservice to the memory of my beloved younger brother, Brian. We know that no workers' compensation award will ever adequately compensate our family for its loss. However, we strongly believe that the determination of compensation should not differentiate based upon one's marital status, especially when a police officer such as my brother dies a violent death while performing his duties. Accordingly, today we ask this committee and the General Assembly to recognize the sacrifice that was made by my brother and will in the future be made by other public safety officers by amending this legislation so all brave officers who sacrifice their lives in the line of duty are fairly compensated.
I think this is the least that we could do to our fallen officers within our state to look for fairness with somebody that's in the law enforcement field that is just a single individual with no surviving legal benefits. So I appreciate the difficulty it is to come here today to talk about what transpired with your brother.
The bill before you, as you have already heard from other witnesses today, includes the identification of trafficking as a specific crime in our state statute and making it a Class B felony. It requires coordination and data collection. It also requires a special contingency fund to provide safety for high security safety for victims. When we identify victims through police or law enforcement action, we have to find a place to keep them safe. So we are recommending in this bill that there be some money set aside for that purpose that would be administered through the Office of Victim Services. And it also recommends that the interagency task force be slightly expanded and continued because, frankly, we have some unfinished business.
The Sparkler bill, the reason for that is, again, it deals with the definition. The industry, the retail industry, and members of public safety and sat down to try to work that out. The current definition is ambiguous and unenforceable.
Is there any reason or evidence why we're increasing the age on the sparklers from age 16 to age 18? If there's been any people that have been hurt, and I want to give you a scenario and tell me if this would be outlawed because of that, the passage of this bill. My son recently celebrated his birthday, and we go to a restaurant, and there's a 16-year-old that works here, and he orders a cake that's got a little sparkler on the top. So the waiter lights the sparkler and brings it over and sings happy birthday to him. If this was passed, would that waiter or waitress be allowed, A, to light that sparkler and bring it to the table? And also, if you could answer the other question about, have there been any injuries or serious injuries or death as a result of sparkler use by persons 16 years of age?
The basic is yes, a 16-year-old will not be able to use it, the 18-year-old would. There are no statistics between the 16 and 18. The discussion that was from the group that was working on this, there are retailers out there that even though the law says 16, they're not selling them to anyone under 18. And it was also discussion that changing it from 16 to 18 would pull that accessibility out of the high schools a little bit more.
The Public Safety and Security Committee will hold another public hearing on Tuesday, February 28th.
Just tend to be in those systems much longer than if they've gone to the juvenile system.
The legislature's Judiciary Committee is looking at proposed changes in the juvenile justice system. At issue, whether 16 and 17-year-olds should be returned to the state juvenile court jurisdiction.
Many people don't realize that Connecticut is one of only 3 states that treats children as adults on their 16th birthday. Only Connecticut, North Carolina, and New York, as I understand it. This is not one of our formal public hearings on a bill. Instead, this is a informational hearing where we're going to receive presentations from a number of nationally known experts who can go over some of the different considerations that the legislature needs to make as we consider whether or not to change the jurisdictional age for juvenile court.
Comparing youths who were transferred in New York or who were automatically adult by virtue of their age, and youths who were retained in the juvenile system in New Jersey. This time they looked at robbers and burglars and added people who had committed assault as well. And again, they did a 7-year follow-up. They found, again, that the transferred youth were twice as likely to be rearrested subsequently for a violent offense, that the transfers were more likely to commit weapons offenses subsequently, they reoffended more quickly, and interestingly, the negative effects were most pronounced for those who had never had the benefit of any treatment in the juvenile system.
But at the moment, there's a lot of concern about the existing juvenile system, even in Connecticut. And the one facility we have for juvenile offenders has been under a good deal of scrutiny and has gotten criticized for the way it's been run, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So do these studies allow for the possibility that some states may be better able to manage juvenile offenders in the juvenile system than other states?
I suspect that your prisons are probably pretty large facilities. That tends to be true almost everywhere. When you have large facilities, punitive security concerns tend to dominate, no matter whether you would like to do treatment or not. So it's much harder to turn an adult prison into a place where positive things are happening for kids than it is to take a troubled juvenile institution and turn that around.
We have to think of the justice system not as simply a bureaucratic process to identify the people most deserving of punishment. The justice system should really be our first resort for public safety. And I'm a little concerned when we identify the issue of prisons as public safety and everything else is not public safety. A good juvenile justice system with good interventions, early intervention, and well-designed programs is your best guarantee of public safety.
Our research suggests that moving 16 and 17-year-olds out of the adult system into the juvenile system, sort of while maintaining, assuming that everything else sort of stays the same as it does today, and not necessarily adding some of the sort of pro-social programs we've heard about, we believe will return about $3 in benefit for every dollar in cost. That assumes that there will be no additional construction required as a result of this change in jurisdiction. If there is new construction required, then the transition will result in costs that are slightly larger than the benefits in the year when that construction occurs, and then sort of about $3 in benefits for every dollar in costs in all subsequent years.
I think it's fair to say that many people advocate if we're going to have juvenile facilities, it should be smaller and more
Right.
specialized, okay?
Yes.
So if that's the course we choose, does your economic analysis still hold up?
Yeah, I think it does, because what we have here is a trade-off. And the trade-off is in the sort of following way. If as investment in the sort of pro-social programs that have been demonstrated to be effective, as those investments increase, the upfront cost increase. But the benefits increase as well, and they increase proportionately. So the better the program, the better the return.
We have perhaps one of the most extensive alternatives to incarceration programs in the nation in terms of the availability of programs for anybody who comes in contact with the adult system in terms of avoiding incarceration. It's probably more important to deal with alternatives than it is to deal with the facility. But then we are also trying to redesign our adult facilities and our juvenile facilities and to measure the results so that we can reduce recidivism everywhere. But I think it's a little bit sidetracking us to talk about, gee, if we just move them from one facility to another, that this is going to solve the problem.
Is the average 16-year-old an adult? We keep coming back to this. And if you're asking me, I would tell you, as I already have, the neuroscience answer is no. But again, I would remind you, you don't need neuroscience. So as much as I'm here as a neuroscientist, I want to remind you to not be overly impressed by neuroscience. We're in the business of confirming that which society has already deemed appropriate.
So it strikes me that what you're here to tell us, and tell me if I'm incorrect, that given the peer pressure that can occur in an adult system versus a juvenile system where there's counseling, we really don't have a choice here. We really need to try to afford 18-year-olds that extra break for juvenile justice and a different system because they haven't developed to the capacity to be put in the other realm.
Not only could you not be more right, but I'll go you one more, because there's also something about the difference in power that occurs in those relationships that actually ups the emotionality. So if you get into a situation where your survival depends on your ability to quickly pay attention to those of higher status, and I can think of no worse situation than prison, you couldn't be more right. The lessons are going to come quick, and they're going to sink in, and they're not going to be forgotten.
The Judiciary Committee plans to hold a public hearing on this issue in the near future.
Good morning, everyone. Going to convene the Environment Committee.
The Environment Committee held a public hearing on proposed changes to Connecticut's bottle bill, which was first passed in 1978. One bill would raise the refund to 10 cents. The other would include water bottles under the law.
I think it's important to recognize that one of the things we're talking about is a change in consumer habits. We've had a bottle bill for 26 years. We drink more water and less of the beverage that had a deposit upon it. We are seeing a shift in the market that the current legislation needs to be adapted to fit.
Thank you, members of the Environmental Committee, for this opportunity to come before you and support Raise Bill 5275, an act expanding the beverage container redemption provisions to the water bottles. I've submitted letters from 2 teams to locals, one in Bridgeport and one in South Windsor, supporting expansion. The teams to support of Raise Bill 5275 is very clear. It's about jobs, jobs, and jobs.
I'm Grace Noem, president of the Connecticut Food Association, and I'm here in opposition to House Bill 5275 and Senate Bill 192. It's probably one of the worst things you could do to the grocery industry is expand the bottle law. We are fine gourmet leaders. We want to bring you the best food, the cleanest food, and we really, really do not want to be responsible for the waste of Connecticut.
As a retailer in Connecticut, I am not in favor of the expansion of the bottle bill, and here are a few of my reasons why. We pride ourselves in this area of cleanliness and sanitation. With the proposed bottle bills, we will be turning our stores into, lack of words, garbage dumps.
Recycling as a whole in this state is at a crossroads. Bottled water containers are a small part of the waste stream, and this committee is going to have to handle what we do to improve recycling across the board. And my testimony, what I'm saying to you here today, is let's work on that together. Let's find ways to find out where these containers fit into that system, because it's going to take a lot of infrastructure. It's going to take some money.
One of the goals here is to more accurately reflect the price of your good in the price that the consumer pays. And I'd have to tell you that I understand that it's going to cost you some $10 million, you say, but part of that might be money you shouldn't be earning right now. Because if I have to raise taxes locally to clean my rivers and my streets, maybe you should be paying for part of that, your company. And if you're making profit off of a good that is being disposed of improperly, you have a part of responsibility that.
There are many ways that a company and that a consumer and everybody along the whole chain that has custody of this product, there are a lot of ways that we can all step up and bear a responsibility. And if you really want to capture a lot of the bottles and the ones that have the most opportunity to be recycled, you'd have more bins in the office. Office recycling has been all about fiber up until now. And you would put some support behind curbside. Yes, curbside is going to take a lot of investment.
The Environment Committee has another public hearing on 20 more bills on Monday, February 27th at 10 a.m.
A very hard, serious look at.
The Energy and Technology Committee heard testimony this week regarding alternative and renewable energy.
I think before you have this mad dash for renewables, tied into the bill should be required a demonstration of net energy analysis. For example, the gentleman that was here, Richard, that spoke that he spent $50,000 for building his facility to generate electricity. Well, that's good, but how much energy went into that facility, to build that facility? Welding, that's energy. It's electricity, but it's still, bottom line, takes fossil fuels. The equipment requires fossil fuels. And so no one's looking at the energy. They're looking at dollars.
You're not talking about payback. You're just talking about
dollars put in to recover something.
No, you're looking at dollars, and this is where the big mistake comes in. I'm not looking at dollars. Dollars is an important factor in consideration. What's far more important is energy consumption to get the energy you're seeking.
I couldn't agree with the gentleman who spoke earlier about net energy assessment more. My whole life and teaching career has been in energy conservation design, energy analysis, and so seldom is the net energy approach taken.
Several years ago, South Windsor obtained a grant to install a fuel cell as a demonstration project. The purpose of the fuel cell was to provide daily power to the high school. It's used in science classes as a learning tool both at South Windsor High School and around the state, and it will serve as the power source for a local and regional emergency shelter. In summary, the fuel cell is exactly the type of alternate fuel project the state is encouraging.
The demand charge, as you're aware, is a penalty essentially that comes upon us. Even if the grid goes down not to our making, if we have to take this fuel cell down to service it, or if it goes offline for some kind of parts failure, basically we get slapped with this charge. It's about close to $2,000 a month. May not seem like a lot of money, but when you're trying to balance the operating costs to make it cost effective in a community, it is a real cost, because when it comes down to it, if this fuel cell is easier or cheaper for us to unplug it and buy power off the grid, when it comes to that decision from the Board of Ed, if they're grappling with paying for something that's costing money versus a teacher in a classroom, you know what the decision is going to be.
We've been looking at this issue of the fuel cell industry for a long time, and it's very complicated. And unfortunately, it relies upon natural gas, which is the worst fuel to be using right now from a number of perspectives. But we thank you for coming up to testify.
The Energy and Technology Committee will hold 3 public hearings next week on Tuesday, February 28th, and Thursday, March 2nd.
And I am proposing today a change that I believe is bold and unprecedented, but very practical.
Attorney General Richard Blumenthal is asking legislators to consider his plan for reducing the high cost of electricity for Connecticut consumers.
First of all, a windfall profits tax that will essentially recover for consumers, put money back in their pockets, the excessive profits that some of the generators are now making. The second proposal is a Connecticut Electric Authority, a longer-term solution that will not necessarily produce the kind of money back this year, but promises potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in savings. This agency would be a public power authority owned by ratepayers, a nonprofit responsible only to ratepayers, not to shareholders, no profits to anyone. Its sole and exclusive function would be to produce the most reliable, least costly power for Connecticut consumers.
The Attorney General is scheduled to present his proposal to the Energy and Technology Committee next week. Coming up next week, the Governor's proposal to eliminate the car tax will be the subject of a public hearing in the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee on Monday, February 27th. The bulletin at www.cga.ct.gov will have more details on the exact time and place. Also, the House and Senate will go into session on Wednesday, the first time since opening day of the 2006 legislative session. If you'd like to learn more about what was highlighted during this edition of the Capitol Report, visit Connecticut Network's website at ct-n.com. Consult CTN's daily schedule for air times of gavel-to-gavel coverage of those events, or watch selected events on demand.